I'm Natalie Haigh, and today I'm going to be showing you how to create a simple tote bag from an old pair of jeans, a pillowcase and some webbing for handles. So this is essentially an upcycling project, although you can use any fabric. I recommend something quite hardy for the outside and something like cotton for the inside. So on the outside I like to use jeans. And I like to use jeans that are the jean legs, the bottom part, because that is a lot less stretch and a lot easier to work with. So what we're going to do is we're going to open up on the seams, just to split it open into a flat piece of fabric. And again with the other side. So what you've got now here is a really lovely seam line. Now, professional sewers will tell you this is the right time to press, but people like me don't have time for pressing. So we're going to do it and go off-piste. So I'm taking a template, which is a 12.5-inch square, which I've done, here's what I did earlier. But I'm using this because I can actually cut around this. Now, if you want to use scissors, you can take a marking pen and making sure your nice seams, nice and parallel here, and you'd actually draw around the shape that you want to cut, and then you can cut with scissors. Now I told you I'm lazy, so I'm going to use, this is a rotary cutter, nice and sharp, so be very careful. And this is a special cutting board. So we're just going to go around, making sure that you get right to the corners. Now, when you come over this bit in the middle where you've got a seam, you might need to just push a little bit harder or cut a little bit firmer with your scissors. And then double check before you move the template that you've actually got everything. So now you can remove the template, you don't need that anymore. And you should have two pieces of fabric that are your outside pieces. Nice square. So you want to keep these up the right way, but you're now going to put, this is the correct side of the fabric or the right side of the fabric, and this is the wrong side of the fabric. So you're going to put right sides together. So, and you're going to line it up. These are going to become the outside of the tote bag. And you're just going to clip roughly, making sure it's all nice and neat. Just enough places to stop it moving and keep the fabrics together. Then you're leaving the top open. For safety, you can always mark, and I suggest this on the back of all your fabrics, a T for top, so that you know that that's the top, that's the bit you're not going to sew. We're now going to take this to the sewing machine, and we're going to go around all three sides, not the top, just with about 1 centimetre or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. So we pop that on, and we're going to go round. Now you should have a guide here for your seam allowance, and we're going to go for 3/8 or 1 centimetre. So we're going to take the first clip out, pop it under the feet. Now I like to hold the tails of the threads, it stops the nesting. Now always go backwards at the beginning as well. This helps lock your seam in. So always guide your fabric through the machine, keeping this line here nice and on your line. Never pull or push your fabric through the machine, because you will upset the machine's tension settings and you will end up with a wobbly or a dodgy seam that won't be very strong. So you want to just keep it nice and gentle. You're literally just guiding the fabric. I'm not putting any weight on it, just making sure that it is nice and straight. And as we come to the corner, you're going to want to judge the distance from the end, which is the same distance that you've just been sewing. So you can either do this with the machine or you can use the hand crank on the side. And then when I get to the corner, I want to stop, needle down, just bring it all the way around, just it starts to come back up again. That holds the fabric. We lift the foot with the neat thing there, just pop it away. And we're going to pivot the fabric without pulling the needle. Perfect. And that's our corner. So from that corner, you're just going to continue sewing as you were. We're going to go all the way along the bottom. Now, at some point along the bottom, you're going to reach these seams. You can see one here. And it's going to be a little bit humpy. Now, this is what this magic hump jump is for. So we can approach, I can feel it with my finger here. So we're going to approach this, and we're going to slide that under the back without getting in the way of the needle, just to help the foot remain flat. If you're going up a hump, the foot will do this, and it will actually change, create some friction for the machine, which will cause problems with your stitching. So this little £2.50 from Amazon or from other suppliers are possible as well, gives you the ability to go over a hump all nice and neatly. So, and you'll see that'll just fall out the back when you're ready. And as we approach the next one, we're going to do the same thing. And then we're going to continue sewing on the final side. So we're coming to the end. I'm going to slow down a little and then I'm going to back stitch just to seal the seam at the end. There we go, and then back stitch. And then we're going to finish with our stitch complete at the top, lift, pull out, and then we're just going to cut the thread. So I've cut out my lining and I just want to use this opportunity to show that with fabrics, sometimes they have direction. So I don't know if you can see very clearly, but there is actually a picture on this fabric, and it's lovely blue and white fabric. We have a bridge there and a building. Now, obviously, if I put this accidentally upside down, although it's the lining, you will notice and you will think, oops. And of course, that's when your trusty seam ripper comes into play, favourite tool in the sewing room. So what we're going to do is we're just going to note what is the top of both of those pieces of fabric just before we put them right sides together. And again, we can do our trusty T to make sure that we know that is the right way up. Now I'm using here a fabric marking pen, which is specially bought, which actually will iron off and disappear if I use heat. So you can mark on the outside of the fabric, but try not to unless you have to. So now that we've laid our lining fabrics right sides together in the square and we've got the tops at the top, we are going to do the same thing and we're going to pin around. Now there's a special thing that we do with our lining, which I sometimes forget to do, so I'm going to tell you now what it is. So we, like the outside, we're going to sew around 3 sides, both sides and the bottom. However, we're going to leave a gap on one side of the lining. Now I like to do it on the right hand side, and I like it to be about 4 inches, 3 inches, as long as your hand can fit in it. So I tend to do that, so right, it's about there to there, and I'm not going to sew this. Now the reason I'm not going to sew this is because we're going to use that to turn or birth the bag, they call it, when we've sewn all the pieces together. So we need a gap. Now, if you forget to do it, it's not a disaster, it's just easier to mark it now. So I've marked that in pen and I will just pin all the way around the side, the bottom, like we did the outer, just with that little additional detail of leaving a gap there. And now we're ready to take this to the sewing machine. So again, we're going to use the same seam allowance on the lining as the outer, which was 3/8 or 1 centimetre, depending on your preference. I'm going to hold the tails at the beginning and we're going to sew a little bit just on the inside of the fabric, not right on the edge, because you can chew up the fabric a little. So we're going to sew 3 or 4 stitches and then we're going to reverse. Now that's especially important when you're using a thinner fabric, that if you start the sewing right on the edge, you can end up kind of catching the fabric in the gap in the foot. So it is nice to just start inside the fabric. So we've done that, we've gone back now, and we're going down to the first line that we've marked on the side. So we've got to the mark, we're now going to go backwards just to stop that stitch, and then we're going to lift. Now I'm not going to cut the thread at this point because I'm lazy, and I'm just going to pull the fabric through gently to where the next mark is and start again. So you'll have a little bit of thread here, but that's okay, you can cut that later. So start again, now it's the beginning, so we're going to go back, and then we can carry on to the corner. So as we approach the corner again, you want to slow down, use the hand wheel, just leave that needle in and then pivot when you think you're at the right distance. Ah, that's good enough. And we're going to carry on along the bottom. Now don't feel like you have to rush your sewing, just sew at a speed that is nice for you. In the corner I have a sewing machine that does 2,000 stitches a minute, and I never use it that fast because I would not be able to control the fabric. So just go at the speed that you feel comfortable with. And then you're at the end, so you're just going to go backwards and finish that stitch. And then for now, we are done at the sewing machine. Right, so I like to keep on top of my loose threads as I go, because you can find that they end up in finished seams if you don't, just with a pair of embroidery scissors or snips. And then obviously we had this bit here. So you see here, you now have between these 2 marks, there we go, threads out of the way, you've got an unsewn part here, which we're going to put our hand in later when we do our birthing. So we now have 2 kind of bucket shaped pieces of fabric. Now, so you can make a bag directly like this, but it would be quite flat. But what we're actually looking for is something a bit more 3D. So here's one we made earlier. And you can see that at the bottom, you've actually got a kind of side, and they're called boxed bottoms. It's one way of making a 3D bag. There are other options by putting side panels, but this is a simple way. And I'm going to show you how to make a boxed bottom now. So while it's still inside out, you're going to put your hand into the bag onto, you've got a side seam and you've got a bottom seam. And you kind of want to lay, can open the seams, but you want to lay the seams sort of on top of each other. It's a bit hard to explain and probably just as hard to show you. And what you're trying to do is kind of go in a different direction to the seams. So I've got the bottom seam here and the side seam here. And you see how, ignoring these bits here, it kind of forms like a triangle at the bottom. And what we're going to do is we want to sew across that to create a square on the bottom. So you should be able to feel that you've got your seams laying on top of each other and you've got this nice kind of triangle. Now, you're going to go in this direction. You're going to mark it first and pin it and then sew it. So the depth that you want the sides to be is how big you draw the line. So if you go as big as sort of say 4 inches with 2 in the middle of the seam, so 2 either side, you will get a bag that is 4 inches wide. Now, probably at this height of bag, probably 4 inches is a little bit wide. So I'm going to go for 3 inch. And I think in instructions I probably recommend 2 inch, but let's be rebels today and let's go for 3. So we're just going to make sure that this line on our ruler is going along the line of the seam. So it's nice and accurate in the right direction. If we went just funny angle, it would be bigger one side than the other. So we're going to go nice along there and we're going to use our marking pen and we're going to mark out 3. Now I think this means that this will be 1 inch from the top, 1.5 inches. So right, so equilateral triangle for you maths lovers out there, and it's 1.5 inches from the point of the triangle here. So once you've got your line there, you're just going to take a couple of pins or clips as I'm using and just make sure that that stays there. So we're going to take the other bottom corner now and do exactly the same thing, just making sure that the line is the same length here and the same distance from the corner, otherwise you will get a wonky bag. So also you need to do exactly the same thing to the lining, because the lining also needs to have a boxed corner. And again, do that on both sides of the lining, pin it, and we're ready to take it to the sewing machine. So back with my second favourite tool in the sewing room, the sewing machine. Of course, my first favourite tool is the unpick. Well, fortunately, we haven't had to use that so far today, so we're having a good day. So I'm going to pop that in, do the usual things, hold the tails, make sure you don't sew over the clips, and then we're going to go all the way across, one end to the other. Now at this point, when you get to the end, you can either go back all the way across or you can pivot and sew forwards, depending on your preference. I'm going to be a rebel and go backwards. Making sure that you're going over the same line. I'm going over a hump, but this machine is man enough. There we go. That is one corner done. And you're going to do that to all 4 of the corners that you've marked. Now we're going to repeat that with our lining, all the way across, going over that central seam and all the way back. Just, oops, wibbling a bit, just making sure that is on the same line as you were. Lovely. And then repeat on the other side. What we're going to do is tidy those corners by getting rid of the excess fabric. And then what we're going to do is to reduce bulk, because this is going to be turned that way round, so you have the outside. This is going to end up on the inside of the bag, inside the other fabric, and it's quite bulky, so we want to kind of reduce the bulk here. So we're going to take some scissors, fabric scissors, and you're just going to cut the same seam allowance just across the middle, be careful over the seam. You end up with a nice little neat square, and you're doing that on all of your corners, so the 2 corners on the outside of the bag and the 2 corners on the lining as well. Now the lining's cotton, so I'm actually going to steal my zigzag scissors or my crimp scissors and do it with that. So we're now going to need our handles on the outside of the bag. So we're going to turn the bag the right way around, putting your hand, see those lovely box corners there. And let's have the seams line up. Doesn't matter if they don't, but it is always fun when they do. And you've got a nice solid bottom there, and this is your outside of your bag, or will be the outside of your bag. So we're going to turn just the outside. For now, leave the lining inside out. Okay, now we're going to use our handles. So you can make handles. There are many tutorials available online about how to make handles, and you can just use webbing, which is a nice easy cheat. It's nice and firm, nice and strong, and with handles especially, you need them to be strong. The last thing you want is to put your favourite items in a handbag and then the handles break. So we're going to do about 22 inch handles, so I'm measuring it along this inch thing here, I'm going to snip. Now this is a nylon webbing. So one of the beautiful things about nylon is it's plastic, which obviously isn't beautiful for the planet. However, it does melt. So we're going to use a flame carefully. And we're just going to melt the edge of that. See how that's melting a little bit there? Careful, it's hot, to be gentle with it. And that just seals it and stops it fraying. And we repeat again with the second handle. So now we've got our handles we need to attach into the outside of the bag, and we're going to do that before we sew the bag together. So I just want to find the middle. Now these seams are not completely in the middle. I had them kind of zigzagged, I suppose, so that they weren't going to be on top of each other. So in order to find the middle, I'm going to take the side seams, I'm going to put them together, and then I'm just going to snip or mark where the middle is. Not too big a snip, you don't want to go into your seam allowance. But you just cut a tiny triangle off there, and that just shows you the middle is there and there. Well, this jeans have a bit of stretch in it, but that should be fine. And that's our middle. And then we're going to want to get our handles kind of equidistant from the middle. So we could go with 4-inch gap. So on a big handbag, you'd have about a 5-inch gap between your handles, so 2.5 from the middle. And because this is only a small bag, I'm just going to have a 4-inch gap in the middle, 2 inches from the middle, and we're going to put a handle on each side. Now I'm demoing it like this to show that the handle's going up, but that's not how I'm going to sew it, and this is a really important point. What we're going to do is we're going to invert our handle, make sure it's not twisted, and we're going to put 2 inches from the middle with a slight overlap there. And just pin that in place, or clip that in place in this case. There we go. Just onto one side of the fabric, not the other. We're just going to pin that there as well. So you see the handle is coming down, there's a 4-inch gap in the middle, and it's not twisted. So I'm just going to do a sort of safety measure, and I'm just going to tack. Tack just simply means like a long stitch. There's a temporary stitch. I'm just going to make sure that I sew these handles in place so that when I do put them inside the lining, then they aren't going to detach. So you don't need to do any back stitching, you're just stitching the handle to where you've clipped it so that it doesn't move when you sew the next bit there. I'm going to go all the way around and make sure we're not moving where we pinned our handles, but we are just catching both the denim and the handle itself. Just about 1/4 inch away from the edge, the top edge of the denim, and they are attached. So now we have our handles attached securely. We are going to make sure that we can get the lining and the outer attached together. So we're going to keep the lining on the inside, so it's inside out as it was sewn, and we're going to keep this on the right way out with the handles facing down. So here, you just want to make sure you've still got your gap. Of course, we remembered to leave that unsewn earlier, and we're going to take our outer bag and we're going to pop it inside the lining. So now you'll notice as we do this, we end up right sides together. So the right side of the lining is together with the right side of the denim, and we're going to start one side and we're going to line up 2 things. So we're going to take the seam of the lining and we're going to lay it against the seam of the denim. Now I'm opening the seam allowance up so you can see it's nice and flat, and I'm going to make sure that the top is also aligned, so the seams are in a line with each other, right sides together, and it's aligned at the top. And then that's because it's a pivot point. I know that that's the right size because I've used the same seam allowance, and then I'm going to go to the other side and do exactly the same with the other seam, like that. Now in theory, if you're sewing very accurately and you cut very accurately, you should now find that there's no puckers in your fabric. So your outer and your inner fabric are the same circumference in this way. Now in an ideal world, where you've marked the middle piece on the outside, you would also mark the middle piece on your lining. No, I haven't done this. And if you do have a difference in the sort of size of the lining or your outer, what you would do is you would find the middle pieces here and you would pin first and then do what they call easing, which is just even out the pucker basically all the way around. So you're just going to put a pin or a clip, the 1/4 points, again making sure that, this is interesting, when I've picked this up, the handle has come outside. Now it's very important that we slide the handle back in between is sort of in the inside between the lining and the denim. So not in the middle of the bag here, actually inside between the lining and the outer. And then give it a little wiggle, see how that fits nice and snugly. And then we will just do a couple more, just making sure that you've got this lovely line up here between the top of the outer bag and the top of the lining. So it's all nice and neat. And there we go. We're now ready to go to the sewing machine. Now at this point, with your sewing machine, you may have what they call a free arm. And this is where a part of your machine actually detaches. We put to one side. Now, probably would have got away with it because it's quite a big circle, but in this case, I just simply find it easier to have a bit more space. So this is a circle. It doesn't really matter where you start. I like to start at the seam. That's how I know that I finished. And you're going to slide, sort of this is the hole for the bag, and you're going to slide it onto the sewing machine, making sure that the other part is underneath and not under the foot where you're going to sew. So put your hand in and it's under the machine. Should make sense when you do it. And we're just going to find somewhere to start, like the seam. And we're going to use a very similar seam allowance that we have been using, or you can go slightly bigger and use 1/2 inch if you want to be safe. And then once we're sure that we're not sewing both sides of the bag together and we're all ready and it's all free and can move around, we can start to sew. So we just start at this seam here. We're going to start forward and backwards just to start the seam, and then taking clips out as we go. We're simply going around the top 2 bits of fabric all the way around the bag. This is where we started, so we're going to come just past where we started and then reverse to finish the stitch, and then we are done. So we now have our lining attached to our outer, but it doesn't look very pretty because it's very inside out. So now we're going to find the gap that we made here, and we're going to do what's called birthing the bag. So just check in, seam sewn all the way around, that looks lovely, beautiful, there's no gaps and there's no problems. So we put our hand, this is why I like to make the gap hand wide, inside, and we're going to really gently find the outside fabric, and we're going to pull it through that gap, really nice and gently. You can pull, you can push, you'll see why this is called birthing. We're pulling the lining out as well. And there we have our outer with our handles now being revealed on both sides. At this point, you're checking your sewing, because if there are any mistakes, see how there's a bit of thread come through there? I'm going to snip that now. If there are any loose threads, there are any mistakes, this is the time where you get your trusty unpick and you correct them. Of course, you do have this gap in the lining where you just birthed it. And you have 2 options of how to close this. So you can use a hand stitch called a ladder stitch or a slip stitch, and you can hand sew that together, or you can be lazy like me and you can pinch the seam allowance folded inside so there's no raw edges, and you can go and edge stitch this at the machine, which I'm going to do now. And then the bag is more or less finished, just for one finishing thing. So this final thing is called top stitching, and it just helps the lining sit inside. You see how it wants to kind of roll up like this? So what we're going to do is we're just going to sort of use our fingers and roll these seams a little bit so that you've got the top and the lining of nice and meeting at the very top. So we've finished going all the way around with our clips or pins. We are now ready to take this to the sewing machine for the final stitch. So top stitching is generally 1/8 inch or 3 millimeters from the edge. In this case, I'm actually going to use slightly bigger, so 1/4 inch, a 3/8 inch, just because, or 2/8 inch, just because I just want a little more play because it's denim. So I've changed my stitch length up to number 4. Just going to hold my tails. And this is going to be visible, so we're going to go nice and steady so we get a nice neat stitch. Now, as you see, we're just about to come up to a seam, and you may notice that the foot is doing this angle where it's breaking. So I've got my needle down, I'm going to lift my foot, and I'm going to go back to my trusty hump jump and slide that underneath, just to create the nice flatness for the foot as we come over this jump. So I've got my hump jump in, I'm making sure that the gap in the middle is out of the way of the needle. We don't want to stitch onto the hump jump. Nice and flat, and I'm going to now continue sewing. And get back to where we started. Now again, this is going to be visible, so we're just going to be really tidy, drawing the line we started at. And then we're going to just do a really quick couple of back stitches just to finish that seam. And we have finished our sewing. Only final touch that we've got is you just want to tidy up your stitching, but that looks good to me. That's not taken us too long. And now you have a lovely tote bag that you can put things in and put over your shoulder. And it's just out of a pair of jeans and a pillowcase, and fairly easy.